For most of modern history, wealth has been treated as a shield. The assumption is simple and comforting. The more money someone has, the harder it is for them to fall. Poverty looks fragile. Wealth look permanent. Yet when you examine the long arc of rich families across generations, a disturbing pattern appears. Extreme wealth does not protect against collapse. In many cases, it quietly accelerates it. At the peak of their power, wealthy families often believe they have escaped the rules that govern everyone else. Their assets are diversified. Their advisors are elite. Their access to influence seems unlimited. From the outside, they appear insulated from risk. But this insulation is mostly an illusion. Wealth changes how risk behaves. It does not remove it. The first mistake rich families tend to make is confusing size with stability. When money grows beyond a certain point, it becomes harder to manage, not easier. Decisions that once felt small now carry systemic consequences. A single miscalculation can ripple through layers of businesses, trusts, and reputations. What once could be corrected quietly now becomes impossible to contain. As fortunes expand, they also become more visible. Visibility attracts attention from governments, competitors, regulators, and the public. This scrutiny creates pressure, and pressure distorts decision-making. Wealthy families begin to prioritize defense over adaptation. Instead of evolving with changing conditions, they focus on preserving what already exists. Preservation feels safe. In reality, it is often the first step toward stagnation. Another early warning sign appears in how wealth changes incentives within families themselves. Money removes immediate consequences. Bad decisions no longer hurt quickly, which means they are rarely corrected early. Risk-taking becomes abstract. Losses can be absorbed, so lessons are delayed. Over time, this breeds overconfidence, not competence. Generational wealth introduces an additional layer of fragility. The individuals managing vast fortunes are often not the ones who built them. They inherit structures without inheriting the context that made those structures work. Systems designed for one economic environment are carried forward into a completely different one. Because they once succeeded, they are assumed to be timeless. This is where arrogance quietly replaces awareness. Success becomes proof of correctness rather than evidence of favorable conditions. Wealthy families begin to believe that their outcomes are the result of superior judgment rather than historical timing. When markets shift, when political climates change, or when technologies disrupt old advantages, this belief becomes dangerous. Early collapses rarely begin with dramatic events. They start with small compromises. A risky investment justified as diversification. A debt structure optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. A governance change that centralizes control in fewer hands. Each decision makes sense in isolation. Together, they build a system that cannot bend without breaking. Liquidity is another hidden fault line. Paradoxically, the richer a family becomes, the harder it is to move its money safely. Large sums distort markets. Exiting positions creates visibility. Holding cash introduces inflation risk and political exposure. Wealth becomes trapped inside structures that promise stability but reduce flexibility. When conditions tighten, these structures turn from protection into prisons. Psychology plays a critical role in this phase. Wealth alters perception of time. Urgency fades. Threats feel distant. Advisors who deliver bad news are replaced by those who provide reassurance. Internal dissent is reframed as disloyalty. The family narrative shifts from adaptation to entitlement. Survival becomes assumed, not planned. The public image of wealthy families also begins to diverge from their internal reality. Outward confidence masks inward fragility. Displays of permanence are often compensations for growing instability behind the scenes. Maintaining the appearance of control becomes as important as maintaining control itself. This focus on image drains attention from underlying structural problems. Another common feature of impending collapse is overextension. Wealth encourages expansion into unfamiliar domains. Success in one industry is taken as evidence of universal competence. Capital flows into ventures driven by prestige rather than understanding. These projects rarely fail immediately. They fail slowly, absorbing resources and attention until recovery becomes impossible. At this stage, wealthy families often double down instead of pulling back. Admitting error threatens identity. Retreat feels like weakness. Losses are framed as temporary setbacks rather than signals of systemic failure. This mindset turns manageable problems into existential ones. Legal and political environments add further complexity. Laws that once favored concentration shift toward regulation. Public sentiment hardens. Tax structures change. Protections erode. Wealth that relied on favorable rules finds itself exposed. Because these shifts happen gradually, they are often underestimated until the damage is irreversible. Internally, family governance weakens. Clear decision-making structures blur as wealth grows. Authority becomes ambiguous. Conflicts are deferred rather than resolved. Succession planning is delayed because discussing it feels uncomfortable. The absence of clear leadership creates paralysis just when decisive action is most needed. Perhaps the most dangerous illusion is the belief that money itself will solve any problem that arises. This belief discourages preparation. It replaces strategy with confidence. When challenges emerge that money cannot directly fix, reputational damage, political backlash, systemic market collapse, the response is delayed and inadequate. By the time wealthy families recognize the seriousness of their situation, their options are limited. Assets are illiquid. Commitments are locked in. External pressures are mounting. The structures built to protect wealth now constrain it. What once felt like an unassailable position reveals itself as a fragile balancing act. This is the quiet phase before collapse becomes visible. From the outside, everything still appears intact. Internally, stress fractures are spreading. The family's greatest strength, its accumulated wealth, has become its greatest vulnerability. Not because wealth is inherently destructive, but because it reshapes behavior, incentives, and perception in ways that undermine resilience. The fall does not begin with poverty. It begins with misplaced confidence. It begins when wealth convinces its owners that the rules no longer apply to them. History shows that this belief is almost always punished. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The question is never whether a wealthy family will face a test. The question is whether their wealth has prepared them to survive it or quietly guarantee that they will not. Collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as a temporary setback, a market anomaly, a political inconvenience, or a public misunderstanding. For wealthy families already weakened by structural fragility, the trigger is often small compared to the damage that follows. What matters is not the size of the shock, but the condition of the system when the shock arrives. The moment of collapse usually begins with a decision made under pressure. Liquidity tightens. Credit becomes more expensive. A key asset underperforms. Confidence, once abundant, evaporates quickly. Because wealthy families are accustomed to control, this loss of control feels unfamiliar and destabilizing. The instinctive response is to protect what remains. But the tools they reach for were designed for growth, not survival. As stress increases, coordination breaks down. Advisors offer conflicting recommendations. Legal strategies clash with financial realities. Public relations concerns override long-term planning. The family's internal decision-making slows just as external conditions demand speed. Delays compound losses. Opportunities to exit gracefully disappear. When assets finally begin to fall in value, the decline is rarely linear. It accelerates. Market confidence turns sharply. Counterparties reassess risk. Creditors tighten terms. The same visibility that once amplified prestige now amplifies vulnerability. What was once admired becomes scrutinized. What was once protected becomes exposed. Money, which once insulated the family from consequences, now magnifies them. Large positions cannot be unwound quietly. Sales move markets against the seller. Losses become public. Speculation fills the information vacuum. The narrative shifts from success to failure, and narratives matter more than fundamentals during collapse. Social dynamics worsen the situation. Long-standing relationships strain under pressure. Allies distance themselves. Former partners prioritize self-preservation. Influence proves conditional. Power, it turns out, was always more fragile than it appeared. When leverage disappears, so does loyalty. Psychologically, this phase is marked by disbelief. Families struggle to accept that their wealth cannot restore the previous order. Each failed attempt to regain control deepens. Frustration. Decisions become reactive. Risk tolerance swings wildly between paralysis and desperation. Neither state produces good outcomes. Legal challenges often emerge alongside financial ones. Contracts are contested. Regulatory scrutiny intensifies. Past decisions are re-examined through a hostile lens. Actions once celebrated as bold are reframed as reckless. The system that once enabled accumulation now enforces accountability. Money cannot buy exemption from changing rules. Reputation collapses faster than balance sheets. Trust, once lost, is difficult to rebuild. Institutions that relied on the family's stability begin to hedge their exposure. Employees leave. Partners renegotiate. What remains of the empire starts to fragment. Each fragment weakens the whole. Attempts to preserve legacy frequently backfire. Efforts to maintain appearances consume resources needed for recovery. Denial delays necessary restructuring. Pride resists downsizing. Families cling to symbols of continuity even as the foundations erode beneath them. At this stage, the original cause of collapse becomes almost irrelevant. The system has entered a self-reinforcing downward spiral. Losses create fear. Fear drives poor decisions. Poor decisions create more losses. Wealth, once a buffer, now fuels the speed of decline because so much depends on so little. Confidence. Eventually, a breaking point is reached. Assets are sold under pressure. Control is ceded to external parties. Long-standing autonomy disappears. The family that once shaped outcomes now reacts to them. Survival replaces ambition. Preservation replaces growth. For some, even preservation proves impossible. What remains after collapse is rarely nothing, but it is never what existed before. Wealth becomes smaller, more constrained, and more closely monitored. Freedom shrinks alongside fortune. The psychological impact often lingers longer than the financial one. Identity, built around control and permanence, must be reconstructed. The broader lesson is not that wealth is doomed to fail, but that extreme wealth creates unique vulnerabilities. It concentrates risk, distorts incentives, and encourages overconfidence. Systems built to grow wealth are rarely equipped to protect it under stress. When conditions change, those systems fail first. History repeats this pattern because the underlying dynamics do not change. Money amplifies human behavior. It rewards success and conceals weakness until both become extreme. Collapse is not an accident. It is the delayed consequence of assumptions left unchallenged. For wealthy families, the most dangerous belief is not greed or ambition. It is the belief that money changes the rules. It does not. It only delays the consequences. And when those consequences arrive, they do so with a force proportional to the confidence that preceded them. The story of rich families ending up broke is not a story of sudden misfortune. It is a story of slow blindness, of systems mistaken for guarantees, of protection mistaken for permanence. Wealth does not fail because it disappears. It fails because it convinces its owners that it never will. By the time that illusion collapses, the collapse itself is already complete.